On behalf of myself, Sylvia Pankhurst, I would like to welcome Katherine Connelly. Where is our lovely Katherine? And can we have a big round of applause, please? I'm sure you'll enjoy this. I'm sure you'll enjoy this afternoon with Katherine, and I'll come back with you on the second half of the afternoon. So enjoy, relax, and sit back.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, I'm all right. Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. And can everybody hear me? Yeah, is that all right? Okay, fantastic. I just wanted to start off by saying I do a lot of talks about the suffragettes, all up and down the country, but I've never ever seen a meeting as beautiful as this. It was such a lovely event, the cakes and the songs and the colours and all the information. It's a real privilege to be here, so thank you so much. I'm really excited about this afternoon, so thank you very much, is what I want to start by saying. Now I'm going to talk about Sylvia Pankhurst and the suffragette movement in general, and I want to start by saying that sometimes it appears that the suffragettes are kind of all around us. They're with us all the time in some senses. You know, if you put on the television and watch the kind of costume dramas that are on at the moment, there's almost always a suffragette character that pops up. They almost always manage to sort of write one in, which obviously is a very good thing. And since 1930, of course, there's been a permanent memorial to the suffragette movement outside the House of Commons. There is a statue of one of the leaders of the militant suffragette movement, Emmeline Pankhurst, which, as I said, stands outside the House of Commons as a commemoration of that movement. But there are some suffragettes that we hear less about. And to start off with that statue that was erected in 1930, this provides us with a very good example of that. That was a very formal ceremony when that statue was unveiled. Lots of ex-suffragettes turned up to pay their respects and to come and speak. The statue was unveiled by the ex-Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. But there was one ex-suffragette sat in the audience who wasn't invited to speak. She was the only one of Emmeline Pankhurst's daughters who turned up to the ceremony, and yet she was not invited to say a single word. And that was, of course, Emmeline Pankhurst's second daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragette that I'm going to talk about. So what was it about this suffragette that was still so dangerous in 1930? Why was this person not part of the official commemoration of the suffragette movement? What is it that means that some suffragettes are now respectable? We are now able to remember them, they get statues. And other suffragettes were dangerous right to the end of their lives. To provide you with an example of this, when I researched this book, I went to the National Archives at Kew, where you get to read, mostly, there's still some things you're not allowed to open from a long time back, several files of which relate to Sylvia Pankhurst. But you get to read what government officials thought about people, you get to read their private notes. And this is a note that dates from 1947, so that's 30 years after the end of the militant suffragette movement. And this is a Foreign Office official writing to a British minister about Sylvia Pankhurst, 30 years after the suffragette movement had ended. And coming across it in the files was quite striking. I was turning the pages, and then there was this note about Sylvia. And he wrote to this other minister, "We agree wholeheartedly with you in your evident wish that this horrid old harridan should be choked to death with her own pamphlets." So that's 30 years after the militant suffragette movement. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst was somebody who never made her peace with the British establishment. It's not a surprise that she never got a statue or that official commemoration. She was somebody who opposed the First World War when that broke out. She supported the Russian Revolution. She took part in the international communist movement in Europe. At that time, she was denied a passport, and they used to hold big congresses of communists from all across Europe. So to attend these congresses, she'd have to smuggle herself aboard little fishing boats and make very dangerous journeys into Europe to partake in these. She was one of the first people in Britain to identify the dangers of the rise of fascism at a time when Winston Churchill was going and shaking Benito Mussolini's hand, the fascist dictator in Italy. Sylvia Pankhurst was saying that fascism would be a complete disaster for Europe, it would end in war, it would destroy women's rights, it would destroy democracy. In a word, it would destroy everything that she and her comrades had fought for. And then in 1935, fascist Italy invaded the African country Ethiopia, and this provided Sylvia Pankhurst with the last great cause of her life. And she campaigned for all of the rest of her life, really, for the independence of Ethiopia, first of all from fascist Italy, and then after the Second World War, when it looked as though the British government wanted to take over Ethiopia. Sylvia Pankhurst campaigned against that, and that's the country where she ended her life. She went and lived out there and helped with the rebuilding of the country after that fascist occupation, raising money to build hospitals and things like that. So that's really why Sylvia Pankhurst remains such a dangerous suffragette. She had this life that was full of activism, full of, she was committed all of her life to changing the world, to making things better for other people. But the lessons of that life, the way that she campaigned, the principles that were at the heart of her campaigning throughout all of her life, those were learned in the suffragette movement. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, of course, there'd been a big movement before what we know as the militant suffragettes throughout the 19th century. This was a campaign that began to be organised in the 1860s, so really after the demise of the big working class movements for change in Parliament, things like the Chartist movement, or thinking further back, things like the Peterloo Massacre. After those had subsided, there arose in the 1860s increasing demands for reform of Parliament, and part of those demands was a women's movement demanding that women be allowed to vote. Now, the women involved in this new campaign were very often middle-class women, and to take an example from Lincolnshire, I know there's the fantastic information over there, it was women like Jessie Boucherette, who was obviously from North Willingham, near Market Rasen, so somebody from Lincolnshire, and it was a woman like Jessie Boucherette who dedicated her life to campaigning for the professions to be opened up to women, that got involved in this early campaign for women to get the right to vote. And sometimes we forget about the kind of things that we do because that they did, because of what came after was so much more dramatic. But these women were starting a very new sort of campaign, and it's worth remembering just how brave they were and how radical they were. So in 1866 they organised a mass petition that they got delivered to Parliament, and this petition called for women to have the right to vote, and they went up and down the country collecting signatures for this. Unfortunately, Lincolnshire was a little bit slow on the uptake over the petition, I have to say. There were only 3 women in Lincolnshire who signed this petition. One was Jessie Boucherette, the second one was Jessie Boucherette's sister, and the third one was Jessie Boucherette's mum. So it was a modest start. But then as this campaign developed, and as women held mass meetings across the country to call for the right to vote, these were meetings that happened across Lincolnshire, across all the towns, and there were in Lincolnshire in the 1870s huge meetings addressed by some of the most famous of what we now know as the suffragists. These women that were campaigning through meetings and petitions and going to Parliament to demand the right to vote. So if you were in Lincolnshire in the 1870s, you would have been able to go to meetings addressed by women like Lydia Becker, who was really the leader of the movement in the 19th century. and even more radical women who even challenged things like the institution of marriage, women like Alice Cliff Scatcherd, all came to Lincolnshire on their tours and addressed these mass meetings. Now obviously that was the 1860s. By the turn of the century, women were becoming deeply frustrated by the way in which they were still campaigning for what they saw really as a basic civil right, the right to vote. And so in 1903, a new organisation was founded in Manchester called the Women's Social and Political Union. Now, what marked this organisation out, first of all, from all the campaigns that had gone before, was the kinds of women that got involved in this campaign. The organisation was set up by the Pankhurst family, who were a radical middle-class family that lived in Manchester. They were quite well known. So it's set up by Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother, and her three daughters, Christabel Pankhurst, Sylvia Pankhurst, who I'm going to talk about, and Adela Pankhurst. So they've been involved in the early socialist movements in this country. So it involved women like them, women involved in the early socialist movement, in the Independent Labour Party. It also involved women trade unionists. Obviously the Northwest in Britain was where all the big cotton mills were, this was work that was heavily done by women, and they had their own trade unions. So very much involved women working in these factories and joining trade unions. But also at the time, there was a campaign to demand that the government provided provision for people who found themselves unemployed, so that people were given work and had some way of keeping their families and themselves at some basic level of subsistence, so people didn't have to go to the workhouse or become paupers. And this campaign was also where this new organisation recruited members from. But it didn't just get members from that campaign. It also derived its different kind of tactics from these new campaigns that we saw at the turn of the century.